With the confirmation of the governor of CBN and his deputies, all eyes are on them now about fixing the economy. So let's identify some KPIs for consideration, having heard his response, his initial address and response to some questions put to him by the National Assembly. Do you think he has what it takes to address the issues in the immediate, that's in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term? Let's have conversations around this, as you've seen there, with Mr. Muda Yusuf. He's founder, no, that should be Dr. Muda Yusuf, right?
It doesn't matter.
He's founder and CEO, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises, CPPE. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and thank you. Good morning, Bukara.
First impressions. Yeah. First impressions from that screening and the comments that the new CBN governor made. What are your thoughts?
Well, very impressive. His responses to the questions was very, very impressive. And I like the fact that he identified some of the critical issues that we had contended with in the Central Bank of Nigeria. And I think the biggest of the issues were corporate governance issues, because he laid a lot of emphasis on issues of compliance. In addition to the fundamental structural problems that we have in the economy, the situation was compounded by the very weak corporate governance that we had in the central bank and the absence of compliance. Because how else will you explain a situation where we had a central bank that did not publish accounts for close to 6 years? And you know how strategic the central bank is to the economy. You know, how do you explain a situation where you had all manner of issues around our foreign exchange markets? Because if you talk to any operator in the economy, they will tell you how bad things were. Then how come we found ourselves in a situation where the central bank was giving ways and means far, far above what the statutory limits are? The statutory limits, according to the CBN Act, is 5% of the revenue of the previous year. Ways and means is the kind of credit or advance or overdraft that the CBN gives to government to fill financing gaps. That is what it means. And there is a statutory provision limit of 5%. What we had under the previous dispensation was higher, 70, 80%. So all of these things created very serious problem and compounded the situation. Then just one more thing. Then there are these encumbrances on our reserves. In fact, that is the most challenging of the problems we have. All the analysis we have been making was based on the fact that our reserves was well above $30 billion US. It just came to the open that the situation was much worse than that. And that is what has complicated matters, even as we speak.
I'm not even sure that, because the new CBN governor also said that it's when they get into office that they'll be able to look at the books and justify whether or not those things are the way they are. But the issues you are raising about the previous administration at the CBN was also inferred in the comments of the President of the Senate. And I'm sure you heard him make quite a number of references to it. You talked about the corporate governance issues, which was a direct responsibility of the governor of the central bank. You talked about the ways and means, which is a direct, responsibility of the governor of the central bank. And the President of the Senate also cited the situation where a sitting governor of the central bank is veering into politics while still in office. It sounds to me, and maybe we should begin from there, that we pay so much attention to the individual that no one is able to take on that individual, or the system is not strong enough to push out or to check the behavior or activities of the governor of the central bank. That's a little concerning, don't you think? Because a situation where those ways and means, we had a national assembly, the governor of the central bank was veering into politics, everyone, you know, saw what was happening, and it would seem like no one was able to do anything. Is there a way to ensure that such doesn't happen? Yeah, the CBN, the president of the Senate, was saying it rather, well, seemingly jocularly. Are you going to go into politics as well? But who is supposed to check the excesses or the exuberances of the governor of the central bank to the point that we don't have to get to the point where we're saying you are spending more than 65% above what you're supposed to spend in terms of ways and means?
You see, these are reflections of institutional weaknesses. Because normally, if you look at the laws and all the structures in place, there are structures to ensure controls. Because just as some people say, trust is good, but controls are better. There are systems in place to ensure controls. Now, the Senate president was also in the National Assembly up until before he became, and he was there when all of these things were also happening. We had a committee that is supposed to exercise oversight over the central bank, both in the Senate and in the House of Reps. What were they doing? Because one of the biggest functions of the National Assembly is to ensure checks and balances. How can you, as a committee of the National Assembly that is supposed to exercise oversight over such a critical institution, sat there and all these infractions were happening?
So you think they're also culpable?
They were compromised and culpable. And that is why in this system, it is good for there to be consequences.
Sorry, on that same issue, sorry, Bukola, sorry. On that same issue, as you said, we have the House committee, we have the Senate committee. Are you saying both of them are culpable?
Of course. How else will you explain this?
But Dr. Yusuf,
we were there for how many years? And all of these things were happening? And none of them had the courage to stand up. But even members of the National Assembly, how many of them stood up to challenge these things? Apart from those in the committees. The whole system was compromised.
But on that same issue, it was addressed by the Senate president when he, told the CBN governor frontally before his confirmation, that, when you get office, you're going to forget that there is a parliament, and would you shun calls or invitations to the National Assembly to answer questions, as was reminiscent of the past. So wasn't that taken care of in that interaction yesterday?
No. We are talking about consequence management. Look at the damage that has been done. What did they do when those things were happening? Because they had the powers. We are talking of a National Assembly that has the power to even remove the president. That is how powerful they are.
But what Bukola is saying is that the man was invited, but according to the president of the Senate, he didn't
show. Then what did they do?
That's the past leadership.
What did they do? We are talking of a national that can impeach the president himself. How can an appointee of the president just disrespect them with such impunity? The point I'm making is that the whole system was compromised. That is why I'm saying that they're also culpable. The system was compromised because when you compromise any institution, you weaken your authority. Compromise weakens the authority. You don't have the moral authority to say anything to the man when you have been compromised. That is my own understanding of the situation.
But was that also taken care of, when members of the Senate were asking about the matter of corporate governance, where the boss doubles also as the chairman of the board? And was his response that, this is how it is done according to international practice? Was this satisfactory enough? And, going forward, perhaps if the law establishing the CBN were to be reviewed and that was to be separate, would it, with the separation of that office, would it serve to check the excesses of anyone that heads the Apex Bank in the future?
I think so. Because sometimes you have to situate your policies and your regulations within the context of your own environment. We have seen that too much powers sometimes can pose a risk to a system. You know, before now, we used to have, even in the banking system, where the MD will also double as the chairman of the bank. But because of all these corporate governance issues, the CBN had to come up with a regulation that you cannot be chairman and be MD at the same time. Now, if you have a level-headed person or somebody who has the right kind of courage to manage the position, it may not matter. But you cannot guarantee who will be there tomorrow. So when you are the CBN governor and you are the chairman of the board, it's extremely difficult within that system to have proper checks and balances. Given our recent experience, it may not happen under this dispensation, but you make rules to guard against a situation where you have somebody who will abuse the position. That is why the structures have to be there, both within the CBN and even outside the CBN.
But do you think the law insulates the CBN governor enough from incursion by political interests?
Of course, to the extent that you cannot remove the CBN governor unless with the consent of the National Assembly, although there are issues around that now. Because people talk about whether suspension is removal or something like that. That has not been finally settled, by the judiciary. I think Sanusi attempted to do it, but he abandoned it halfway.
But why was that not the case during the last administration when we had the naira redesign policy where fingers were pointed at, members of the presidency of the last administration, and then his purported incursion into politics? That's the former CBN governor. Well,
it's a function of how people have the courage to also speak truth to power. Under the Buhari administration, there was this imperial disposition that wherever the president stands, nobody there goes to challenge his position. And the previous governor was able to do that because he had the backing of the president from all we saw. And once he had that, he was able to intimidate everybody, even including the National Assembly. So that was why they could not do anything. So for me, the National Assembly has not done well at all at that time. I mean, look at the way the naira redesign went. The man called the bluff of everybody. Almost even including the Supreme Court.
Dr. Yusuf, let's make some progress, because now that we have a new dispensation on our hands, one of the things that the new CBN governor said is that if they are confirmed, the immediate plan is to stabilize the naira. The immediate plan to stabilize the naira will be for the Apex Bank to settle some financial obligations and make what they call transparent rules. First of all, there are those who are wondering what that means. And secondly, how significant do you think that would be in the immediate?
No, that's very significant. Because you know how sensitive the economy is to foreign exchange issues. This economy is highly sensitive to developments in the foreign exchange market. Unfortunately so. Because the level of import dependence is extremely high. So managing the forex environment is the topmost priority for him. And what we're experiencing now, and just in line with what he said, is almost a total collapse of confidence. And once confidence collapses in any system, the whole thing will spin out of control. That is why we are seeing the kind of, very serious speculative activities now. Both those who need the dollar for business, those who don't need the dollar, those who just want to convert them, all of them are rushing now to buy foreign exchange. And that's a major issue. Look at where it has gone. So what he said is right. We need to move very quickly to restore confidence. But the bigger challenge is, where is he going to get the supply?
Absolutely. Can he
to deal with that?
Can he achieve that without the federal government's definite support of plugging the loopholes in crude oil theft?
Well, that is part of it. But the best he can do as a central bank is to look at the policies that are existing and remove barriers to inflows, remittances, and other foreign inflows into the economy. And he said it repeatedly that he will have to work in collaboration with the fiscal authorities to achieve most of these things. Because the challenge is both policy related and also structural related. And some of those things will take some time because we are talking of a backlog of maybe $6 billion, $10 billion. It will take time
and maybe
to clear that. And if you don't clear the backlog, you cannot properly restore confidence in the system.
I know my colleague in Abuja has more questions for you, but just before we go to Abuja, the promise of, doubling the growth rate and achieving a $1 trillion economy in the next 8 years. How realistic is it? Is it okay to give highfalutin promises that like most administrations and their representatives give, and 6, 7 years down the line, it's still eluding the country?
Well, 8 years. 8 years is a long time if we really get things right. Because this economy has the fundamentals to deliver on that kind of promise. I say that because we have the resources and we have the people. The biggest obstacle to the economy is those in governance. Once we're able to fix that, and once he's able to do some of the things he said, and once those in the economic team are also able to do the right things, we have the entrepreneurs. We have those who can create the wealth to take us to that point in 8 years. I believe it's something. And we have the resources anyway. Most of our resources are being suboptimally utilized. We are not capturing value the way we should capture value. It's feasible if we do the right things.
Absolutely. Nyota.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Yusuf, my colleagues have asked a lot of questions, but let's look at this matter of the inflation rate. I know he talked, the new CBN governor talked about what he's going to do, or the exchange rate. He's talked about settling on unsettled obligations and rules that are transparent, putting out rules that are transparent, that even the investors will clearly see that this is what we're doing. Again, that will work. But see what the IMF was talking about. IMF put out, or giving hints on how to avoid a debt crisis, says policy changes are more likely to yield tangible results if the fiscal institutions are strong and efficient. So we have a new CBN governor who has a reputation, and he has talked about some of the things he's going to do, the low-hanging fruits that he's going to handle. The question is, being a monetary policy organization and what they're supposed to do, are the fiscal institutions strong enough to handle what he's coming up with?
Well, it's time that will tell, because it's still early days. But what I do know is that, unlike what we had under the previous dispensation, there's likely to be better coordination under the current dispensation, given the background of both the finance minister and, of course, the Central Bank of Nigeria. Given their background, given where they are coming from, given their credentials, I expect that there will be better coordination. If you have a much better coordination, then a lot of these macroeconomic challenges will be easier to deal with. Unlike what we had in the previous dispensation, there was really no, that chemistry was not there under the present dispensation. There was a whole lot of silo mentality or silo approach. People were operating in silos and all of that. There was all manner of territorial, sensibilities under that administration. But from some of the documents that we have seen, there's even a structure to ensure policy coordination. And that is why we have a coordinating minister for the economy, not just a finance minister. So from that point of view, I think that we should expect a better synergy and collaboration between those key institutions. But when you talk about inflation, you see, apart from the point that the CBN governor made about money supply, and that was also a very, very important point he made, the impact of money supply and the impact of monetization of deficit on inflation, which he has promised to check. Apart from that, practically all the key instruments of fighting inflation have almost been exhausted by the central bank. The cash reserve requirement currently is 32.5%. It's one of the highest that you can have globally. And the implication of that is that for every 100 million naira deposits that gets into the banking system, 32.5 million is sterilized with the Central Bank of Nigeria. And if you talk to those who are operators in the sector, the percentage is even much higher than that. Some of them have a CRR of almost 50%. Then you have the MPR, which is already at 18.5% or so. So these things are already extremely high. So that is why some of us are saying that the bigger issue with inflation has to do with the structural issues, creating the environment to boost the supply side of the economy, to increase productivity in the economy, and on the monetary side, to have some controls over the rate at which the CBN is printing money, or the rate at which the CBN is financing deficits. I think for inflation to be tackled, those two sides, both the fiscal and monetary, have very big role to play. But more importantly, the fiscal side.
So that part about increasing the productivity of the economy, how would that work, seeing that the interest rates are so high? You talked about the deposit rates as it is, 32% already. That pushing on to the interest rates, how would that, if the manufacturers and those running the industries cannot have access to finance, and when they do have it, the rates are so high up there, how would that affect their productivity?
Well, interest rate is an issue, but there are bigger issues affecting productivity. Right now, diesel price is crossing 1,000 naira per liter. You can imagine the implication of that for productivity. In an economy where in the last 1 or 2 months, we have been seeing frequent collapse of the national grid. Imagine the implication of that for the cost of production. Some businesses are already even packing up. Because how do you deal with a situation where you have very serious challenge with the cost of energy, and you have very serious challenge with foreign exchange? Not many businesses can survive that for long. And some of them have even suspended operations. Many of them are running at a loss as we speak. They're just operating their businesses just to be able to generate some cash flow, because they cannot pass on all the costs to their customers. Purchasing power is weak. Disposable income is very low. So many businesses are in a quandary. Yes, interest rate is something that we need to deal with. Although if we're able to tackle inflation, that may help with reduction in interest rates. But there are bigger issues, more than that. Because energy issue is a big issue. Foreign exchange issue is even a bigger issue. So these are some of the macroeconomic things I think that needed to be tackled, in addition to seeing what we can do about the issue of the cost of fund.
In tackling these macroeconomic issues, see some of the things that he put out. He said, these are all evidences you put out. It says evidence-based monetary policies. That's what he's going to be foreseeing. So the policies will be based on evidence. But he said at least 50% of inflation has been as a result of money supply and deficit financing. So he will work with the fiscal institutions to manage the deficit financing matter of things. But the low-hanging fruit in this area of inflation, managing the inflation situation, even as the experts have said, this is the area he needs to pursue. What would you be advising that be done immediately? Because the manufacturers are crying, the consumers are crying, because they are bearing the brunt of all of these things. And even the government is beginning to cry because of what all the other parts of the society are going through. So what would be the things that you think the institution should handle immediately?
Well, there is no quick fix to this, given the key drivers of inflation.
The quick fix?
There is no quick fix. But in terms of some quick responses, because in his interaction with the National Assembly, with the Senate, he did talk about the issue of money supply, which you also alluded to. Of course, that can be dealt with as quickly as possible, but it is not likely that you get immediate results. But what I would suggest is that we need to look at our fiscal policy instruments, particularly in the area of import duty, some taxes and things like that, because we are dealing with a situation where for many of the products, particularly for those in production, import duties that they pay are still very high. So when you have high import duty and you have a very weak exchange rate, it's a double whammy. On top of that, you have high energy cost. So if you cannot control the energy cost because these are, external variables, something that are external to our environment, at least we can control our import duty. Import duty on critical raw materials, import duty on critical inputs that people are using for production. I think that is one quick thing that we need to do. Unfortunately, I've not heard so much about using the import duty or the tariff or trade policy instruments to deal with the current challenges. I think we need to look more in that direction. We should not be too focused on generating revenue to the extent that we go and suffocate the system. You should create a breather, especially for those in production. If you cannot bring down immediately the exchange rate, at least you can bring down the import duty and some of the taxes for some critical components of the economy. I think that is one thing that can be done immediately, in addition to, of course, the medium to long-term issues of trying to reduce money supply, curbing insecurity, ensuring that electricity supply, and all of that.
Dr. Yusuf, when you say reducing money supply, then there's the other bit about domestic, mobilizing domestic revenue. Let's put the two and two together. If we're going by the IMF's recommendation of saying mobilizing domestic revenue is less detrimental to the growth of a nation's economy, and then you're talking about reducing money supply, can we work out a balance here that, again, of course there are no quick fixes, but there are some quick responses that can be done. So we know that the local debt as it is right now is very high up there, but we're still talking about how to mobilize funds for the manufacturing industry. And you're talking about the things that are already too high and need to be brought down. So if we're going by the IMF's recommendation of mobilizing domestic finances, yet you're saying we should cut down the supply of money. Please, let's work out a balance. How do we balance things out here?
No, that's a distinction between revenue and money supply. They are different things.
Okay, please clear that up.
Yes, they are different things. Revenue is about issues of taxation and also non-tax revenue, how you can generate revenue from those who are operators in the economy by way of taxation. Money supply, that especially the component that the CBN governor referred to, is this idea of printing money. The ways and means that was recently securitized reached a level of almost about 23 trillion before it was securitized. That is huge liquidity. That's huge pumping of money into the system. These are monies. These are inflows into the economy that you cannot tie to any productivity or economic activity within the economy. So it is that kind of money that is injurious to the economy, and that is the kind of thing that we need to cut down. The normal taxes are things that are derived from normal economic activities. So that is the difference. The money supply, especially the financing of deficit by the CBN, is very, very injurious and detrimental to the economy. It creates challenges for inflation, it creates challenges for exchange rates. And I think the CBN governor emphasized that very well during his interaction.
Dr. Yusuf, we'll take a moment and go on a quick break. When we come back, that matter of mobilizing domestic revenue, especially for the manufacturing industry, and to quick-start the economy, we'll look at that when we come back from this break. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Our closing moments with Dr. Muda Yusuf, founder, CEO of Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise. Dr. Yusuf, that matter of mobilizing domestic debt. I know that on the floor of the Senate, one of the senators was advising the new CBN governor to take advantage of the borrowing gap. Debt to GDP right now stands at about 30%. Saying you could still harness up to 70%. But how do we go about mobilizing revenue within local revenue, domestic revenue, without adding too much of a burden on our debt stock?
Well, I think the president has started well with the Taiwo Oyedele committee that was set up. They have a clear roadmap as to how to achieve revenue optimization. So, I mean, they are talking about harmonizing collection of revenue, for instance. That, for me, I think is a step in the right direction. They are talking about plugging leakages, particularly with respect to the MDAs that are generating revenue and that are not remitting what they should remit. I think that, for me, too, is also good. Then some of the reforms that have taken place, particularly the forex exchange rates convergence and the fuel subsidy removal or reduction, has also, boosted revenue significantly. And evidence of that you can find in the last FAC meeting, where they had so much revenue that they had to cut back on even what was to be distributed. So these reform measures are also boosting revenue. But we need to also move quickly, to ensure that we create the right environment for those businesses that are generating the revenue for government. Because if they continue to face the challenges, particularly the kind of challenges they are facing, then the outlook for revenue may not be as bright as people expect. Because, I mean, you have to be in business to be able to pay taxes. You have to be doing well to be able to pay taxes. So all the critical issues confronting domestic businesses, I think, is something that we need to prioritize. Yes, it's good to look for foreign investors and so on, but we need a lot more focus on domestic investors and addressing their concerns. And the CBN governor also talked about the issue of stakeholder engagement. I think that is very critical. Policymakers cannot understand the economy better than those who are operators in the economy. So both the CBN and all the key ministries should regularly engage with the stakeholders so that whatever policies they are putting in place will be fit for purpose. You don't impose a policy that is not appropriate for the kind of environment in which you are. So stakeholder engagement is extremely very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just the CBN and the ministries, but also the manufacturers as well. And I noted that earlier you touched on the CBN, the new governor's resolve, to sanitize that sector by taking a look at the rules of operations. You talked about an economy where the energy sector is hugely dependent on the foreign exchange market as well, because it's also denominated in dollars. But look at this, Dr. Yusuf. On the front page of The Guardian this morning, the big story is more factories, businesses may shut down as diesel hits 1,100 naira per liter. But there's also something that it talks about, what manufacturers spent on alternative energy between 2016 and 2022. And there are huge figures here, Dr. Yusuf. So what's the potential of this alternative energy market within Nigeria? And what rules of operations would you be recommending that the federal government, through the new CBN leadership, puts in place such that manufacturers can be less dependent on these other main energy sources?
Well, I think these are essentially fiscal issues. And the government needs to respond to the issue of power supply very urgently and more fundamentally. Because if we had steady public power supply, why would people be relying on diesel for production? Why would people be relying on PMS to power their generators and all of that? So we should prioritize improvement in electricity. The government has done well, at least we have seen some policy reforms, decentralizing electricity generation, distribution, and all of that. But we need to do that a lot more quickly so that we can deliver power.
But there are other power sources that manufacture.
There are other power sources, but the cheapest of all, the most dependable, and given what is happening all over the world, is this public power supply. It's cheaper than diesel, it's cheaper even than gas, and it's much more environment friendly. So the government needs to do a lot more. We cannot just leave it entirely to the private sector, because power is a developmental issue. You don't leave something that is purely developmental, that is strategic to economic development, that is strategic to productivity and competitiveness. You don't leave it entirely to the private sector. So governments will have a way to also have an input and do some heavy lifting in the power sector so that the private sector can take over from there. You can see that most of the investors in that space, most of them are struggling.
Even the good number of people will say what has been, excuse me, it was in the hands of the government before, and some sectors of it are still in the hands of government. I don't know what have we come up with. Anyway, excuse me, but that's beside the point. Just before we go, Dr. Yusuf, I want to ask this question. In the light of the previous administration's Chinese yuan naira swap, that's the perspective from which I want you to look at this. The dollar has been the global reserve currency since the 40s. And I understand that there are a number of other countries who are looking to other, reserve currencies as opposed to the dollar. Given the volume of trade between Nigeria and other countries other than the US, and by the way, it so happens that China has the largest reserve of more than 3 trillion in its reserves. So one wonders then, do you think Nigeria should be looking to a different reserve currency so that maybe that will, one way or the other, reduce the dollarization of the naira? Do you see that happening?
Well, it's a good idea to diversify, the way in which we keep our reserves. But what is most fundamental is to build an economy that is very productive, that is competitive, regionally and globally. Because whether you are talking of Chinese yuan, you are talking of dollar, you are talking of euro, your capacity to earn those things depends on what you're able to produce and how competitively you're able to produce. I think those are the more fundamental issues. Of course, there are a lot of sentiments about moving away from the dollar and all of that. Our destiny is in our own hands. If we're able to have an economy that's very productive, and we'll be able to have more say as to what happens. And in any case, trade is not business that does the trade. I mean, it's not government that does trade, it's business people. So the business that will determine if you export to China or somewhere, you are going to determine which currency you want to be paid. And it depends on, again, how liquid and how reliable those currencies are.
Because when I look at the Chinese yuan to the naira, it's just over 100 naira. And then to 1,000, come on. Don't even answer that one. Dr. Muda Yusuf, founder, CEO, Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, my pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we're back right after now to take on another conversation when we return from this break. Do stay with us.